Well, it's a great pleasure to introduce and welcome Ilene Bothma to this the second last artist's talk for the year. Ilene, if you don't know her, she did a Bachelor of Arts degree at Stellenbosch University. She actually has 2 master's degrees. She did the one at Stellenbosch and the other one at Northumbria University in the United Kingdom. She's really prolific as an artist. She participates in numerous group exhibitions, and she's had 6 solo shows, the most recent of which is Life, Death, and All the Fear in Between, which is on at 99 Loop Street in Cape Town. And she's going to be talking about that, introducing us to that show today, after introducing her works in general. So a huge welcome, Ilene. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Brenda, and thank you so much to Irene, who actually instigated this whole process, and also for writing the most beautiful article on my work. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you. So we are currently inside 99 Loop Gallery, and some of my work is behind me there. And like Brenda said, the show that's on now is titled Life, Death, and All the Fear in Between. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to just give you a bit of background and then start talking, going into the PowerPoint to start talking about works that almost led up to the show. So I'm going to pull out almost chronologically over the past 10 years the main things that has been important in my practice, dealing specifically with womanhood and then motherhood, which became my main focus, I would say, over the past 4 or so. Like Brenda said, I studied at Stellenbosch. I started in 2000 undergrad fine arts, so that is literally 20 years ago. It does make you feel quite old. And then I did my master's right after that, also at Stellenbosch. And in retrospect, that was quite a bad decision. I needed to live a bit more life. And I went from a cum laude student to basically 60% struggling, feeling like a failure, falling my way through it. And then I started teaching a bit of high school, as you do, in order to pay off the student loans. I then got married in 2009, and then I decided, well, my husband wanted to study overseas. I don't know why, he just did. And then I said, well, let me go redo my master's. Because at the time I was doing my master's, my twin brother left the country. My supervisor left in the middle of the master's degree. I started getting panic attacks. It just felt like I want to kind of revisit this whole situation. And my husband knew the chancellor, I think, at Newcastle University, and we couldn't afford London, even if we wanted to. But everybody was going to the UK at the time. I think it was 2009. And so we decided, let's go. And there's 2 universities in Newcastle upon Tyne. It's Newcastle University and Northumbria University. So what was lovely about Northumbria is that they had a master's program that was only 1 year. It was a bit of a structured master's. And you wrote not a full kind of dissertation, you wrote a PhD proposal, which was very interesting. And I think that's more or less where things started for me. I turned 30 in the year I was there, and I think it was important for me to do a lot of growing up in order to find my way. Coming from a kind of a very Afrikaans service, I think I needed to see a bit more of life and live a bit more life in order to find my groove, if you will. So now I'm going to attempt to get to the PowerPoint. Okay, there we go. So I'm hoping you guys can all see that. I titled it Pulling at the Thread because although I'm going to focus on my ceramic work and my painting work, I think textiles forms such an integral part of the work that you'll kind of see that material thread and pulling through, if you will. So I've always been interested in identity politics, ideas around self, family, and relationships, but I really struggled to visually articulate these ideas before I started studying in Newcastle at Northumbria. So what I want to first look at first is the works that I did during, or one work that I felt was quite important that I was doing when I was studying at the time. So during my master's studies, I developed a term called weird marriage. One of the lecturers once asked me, but what is it about your life that you want to say? Because I was struggling with all these intense emotions. I want to deal with identity. I want to deal with the self. But what exactly is it that you want to talk about? She asked me. And I told her that, well, I'm finding marriage really weird because it was the first, I think I was about 6 months into my marriage. And so we kind of coined this term weird marriage and developed a whole methodology around it. So I had a whole list of things, but I'm just going to pick out a few now. So descriptions of my, so it became important that this was how I felt, that the work had to say something about the idea of weird marriage. I had to combine weird materials or what I considered weird materials. So it would often be a chair or some kind of domestic object paired with stockings or hair or something that has a more bodily connection. The labor involved in making the work was also quite important. So it had to mimic the domestic space and ritual and repetition in that sense was then also very important in the making of the work. And then I think I was very interested in the idea of the uncanny. So the work had to evoke some sense of the uncanny and then sometimes also a sense of the abject. So this work, titled Nothing Without You, was one of the works that I felt was very successful in terms of all those kind of requirements that I kind of made up for myself. This was created by using the seat of a chair that actually features in another work, and I felt that by merging the kind of male and female aspect in this object, it really worked for what I was trying to say about relationship. The seat becomes almost like a placeholder for the body, so there's anthropomorphism happening here. And then the stocking that is covered over this entire seat is sewn in with hair. Let's go to the detail. So that pattern is actually from my wedding dress. So I sewed it in with my hair. I usually collect my hair in the shower because it also drives my husband quite nuts when the hair is all over the place. And yeah, so just to go back, with the stockings hanging down at the bottom, it could be quite testicle-like. The gusset area could look like a penis, but it is in actual fact made for the vagina. So there's a lot of commingling of masculinity and femininity happening. then the title "Nothing Without You" is a bit of tongue in cheek, suggesting that codependence within the relationship. So I was starting to play a bit with my titles, and I actually like adding a bit of humor in these things because I think there's a lot of humor to be found within these weird domestic situations. Uh, so that entire body of work, if you'd like to see it, is on my website, and it deals with very much with the domestic space and how relationships in that. Um, and then I was very happy because the, the the work was at 80%, and I felt like very happy to have redone and gotten back to my academic kind of prowess, if you will. So when we came back to South Africa, I had to start a job lecturing at Vega, which is like the advertising school here in Cape Town. And I was teaching students that were telling me, we're paying your salary, and they had absolutely no interest in fine art, and it was quite soul destroying. And I was probably also quite bad at managing their very clear disdain for my subject matter. So that wasn't probably the best um, time of my life. So within this space, I further developed some ideas around weird marriage, and this piece titled Hairline Cracks were born. And it consisted of 7 different sound plates. So I'm going to just move to a detail quickly. These images were all sanded off and then redrawn uh, with hair and super glue. So it was extremely tedious work. And I think they're quite evocative because they're very fragile, but still beautiful, and then obviously containing something of the abject in the use of hair. So although they are quite pleasing, um, and um, they are still a little bit disturbing in a sense. So that's a tension that I really enjoy playing around within my work, having works that are still quite beautiful or comfortable to look at, if you will, but still disturbs the senses in a little way. So the works are displayed quite old-fashionedly in a way, so the way I would imagine that they would hang against my grandmother's wall. So there's a certain sense of nostalgia embedded in uh, these kind of second-hand objects themselves. So I often find that I like uh, using second-hand objects because I like the history that's already embedded in the objects themselves. Um, so because the, a lot of the images uh, are degraded or faded through sanding them off. I think I was playing around a bit with memory in these works, um, and the act of redrawing memories almost. So rewriting the history of these plays. And also then, of course, there was a bit of an act of subversion, I would imagine, going on about the kind of domestic place of the woman. The woman has to collect pretty plates. She has to be uh, displayed in a certain sense. So I think by erasing the pretty flower images, I was trying to subvert that role of the woman in a way. And then, of course, the obsessive compulsive nature of redrawing these things so meticulously uh, goes back to my idea of the domestic space and the kind of tedium around that space that I wanted to illustrate in the works around weird marriage. So at the time then I decided to quit my job after about 3 years and make art full time when I found out I was pregnant. I've been trying to get pregnant for a year, and then I kind of decided, stuff it, let's move on. And yeah, so the moment I decided I want to make art full time and not full pregnant, I fell pregnant. So that is life. So this work uh, was this triptych is titled "Lay Down the Swan," and I made this work while I was on a residency at Saint Jean Port Joli, which is deep French Canadian country. They are photographs of which the surface has been altered. Let me just go to the detail there through embroidery. So the embroidery kind of moves over the surface to cover the entire kind of watery area at the bottom. So let's just, if you can see at the detail there, you can see the slightly protruding belly. I was pregnant with Mia at the time. And I think maybe that's why I was also making these kind of strange bubble-like shapes. And I was very isolated as well. So the people around me only spoke French. The other people on the residency had a basic grasp of English. And so I was very much focused on my relationship with this child growing in my stomach. And these sculptural shapes that you can see on the figure, which is me, of course, was part of like a sculptural installation I was trying at the time, and it never really worked in the way I wanted to. But because it was so big, I couldn't bring it back to South Africa. And two photographers that were on the residency with me, and Lupin and Orion Vidal, they offered to help me document the work. But we decided that we might as well burn these objects because they're not going to go anywhere anyway. So this image actually came about quite accidentally because we were carrying it to the water, to the grass and the water to burn it there, but my arms got quite tired of carrying these things, and I just kind of put it on top of my head, and I'd taken my skirt off because I was tripping in the long grass, which is never a great idea for a pregnant woman. And as I put it on my head, we started photographing this whole thing, and some quite magical images came out of it. So what we call happy accidents, I imagine. What was really great about this work was the kind of narrative that developed out of it. That's also where the title "Lay Down the Swan" obviously comes from Zeus transforming himself into a swan in order to rape or seduce Leda. And I liked the narrative around this myth, specifically the idea of violence. And in these images, I want to suggest that raft, pink, strange, cell-like thing that's floating towards the mermaid-like creature on the rock is quite malevolent and then threatening in some way. And then, of course, it evokes these kind of oceanic myths of the mermaid leading the sailor to drown with her seductive powers. So, and then obviously it being a triptych also enhances that narrative potential. And then again, the act of embroidering into the surface is a violent act. I find that kind of piercing and the penetration of the surface, and that implies a kind of a wounding and a suturing, a breaking and a binding. It was quite a seductive thing as well. Then the act of embroidery is, of course, a bit of something of a bygone era. Although I know craft with that specific craft has quite a comeback in a lot of feminist art practices and activism, especially in the 1970s. This wasn't actually part of my kind of lived experience. For me, embroidery was very much something that my grandmother did, and my mother sometimes did. And it was these images that home is where the heart is, and the little flowers on that with needle pointed onto cushions kind of thing. So I liked the idea of using something quite nostalgic in relation to something that has quite as a bit of a violent or kind of menacing story behind it. But the main significance of this work within the context of this discussion is really that it was the first time that I started thinking about motherhood and using myself as a mother within my work. This work was also chosen, I think, for the 2015 APSA Atelier as that I was a finalist, and then it was only after this that 99 Loop Gallery contacted me to do a solo exhibition with them. So it felt like quite an important moment over the past 10 years where I got a solo show out of this image. I started investigating motherhood, and it moved me forward in my career, if you will. And again, it also investigated the textile element. So this piece titled Credible Thread formed, it's watercolor on Hahnemuhle paper. It was part of that first solo that I then did in 2016 at 99 Loop Gallery. It was the end of August, I think. So the entire show was titled Veiled Thread, and it was made up of a series of self-portraits where it was almost like this floating head that was covered in some kind of veil. I eliminated all the shoulders from the images. And I started investigating ideas around identity politics within domestic space, specifically the role of the woman within the sphere. And this is the first time I really started creating these so-called masks or coverings for my face, which is something that I've been doing for the past 5 years, I would say, quite regularly in my work. My daughter was about 10 months old when I started these images, and she was about 1.5 when the work was shown. In retrospect, I think a lot of these masks or coverings was an investigation of my sense of identity, although it was an investigation of my sense of identity. And I think it was very much also my experience of motherhood that was on display. I think that sense of being trapped within this incredible responsibility, the constant breastfeeding, being up half the night. Mia still doesn't sleep, although she's already 6 years old. The sheer exhaustion and the weight of it, I think, was very much illustrated in these coverings or veils. And I think there was a lot of this was a lack of control, and maybe I was trying to assert control over these works by doing them specifically in watercolors. Because with watercolor, you have to have extreme control over your medium, and there's very little room for mistake. So I think also these kind of coverings were influenced by my interest in more kind of performative work, although I would never really do a performance myself. I like the idea of work like by artists such as Cindy Sherman, where there's a bit of an enactment of a different personality, and maybe perhaps these images were a bit of escapism as well from the weight of that responsibility. A lot of these ideas I start thinking up as I was working through this PowerPoint, because I think at the time I think a lot of the times the ideas develop as we look back at the work, and it's not all necessarily resolved even when it is presented in a show. So as the work was on the wall of the gallery, I think about a week before that, I found out I was pregnant with my second baby. I call him my happy accident. But yeah, so he was born at the end of March in 2017, and my next solo show was scheduled for the end of October 2017. So there was a lot of work and a lot of intensity going on at the time. I'm not going to go into too much detail on the exhibition that this work was on. It was titled The Theatre of the Mother Chord, and it was made up of a lot of different mediums, sculpture, embroidery, watercolor, ceramics, um, yeah, and smaller watercolors as well. I think I can't remember. Anyway, that's not important. I want to focus more on the painting and ceramic work, as this is where the ideas around motherhood is more evident. So this is titled Mother's Milk. It was my first oil painting since having done one or two small experimental works in my undergrad year. Technically, I'm kind of self-taught by, let's say, YouTube and Google and from asking some other artist friends. And the reason for this kind of shift in medium was simply because my husband said that oil paintings will sell better. And he kind of put it out as a bit of a challenge for me. And I really wanted some semblance of financial independence at this point because I'd quit my work, my job as a lecturer some time ago, I think about 5 years before this. And although this financial independence hasn't quite materialized yet, we're working on it. So I think it's quite easy to see the development from Credible Threat, the previous image, to this image, where a very kind of similar covering starts covering both me and my son. So this work was again about the restrictive elements around motherhood, the restrictive nature of that bond between mother and child, but with the breastfeeding physically featuring in the image. I try to use a kind of a goldish color to again bring in the aesthetic element, make it as aesthetically pleasing as possible, while still maintaining that kind of discomfort by displaying a very personal, very private moment in the public domain. So there's a very obvious Madonna and child reference here. And I felt also that making the work in oil was quite appropriate in that kind of historical sense. So I wanted the uncanny element to come through as well, and I think it was quite successful in using that covering over me and my son. Then this work, which also formed part of Theatre of the Mother Chord. I don't want to delve too deeply into it, but you can see again the covering featuring in the self-portrait on this handmade porcelain plate. It was the first time that I started experimenting with ceramics, and I wanted to make Delft-like plates that looked like they were melting. I was, again, as in the previous works, looking at the role of the woman within the domestic space, the role of the wife, and I wanted to kind of subvert the norms of what is expected of the woman in the home. So this work formed part of a series, and at the time I was my son was about 4 months old when I started making this. I had a 2.5-year-old that had never slept. So the title Mid-Morning Slump was very much a bit of a parody and a bit of humor that I was throwing in there. Mommy is very much melting by mid-morning and crumpling under the weight of the expectations. So I guess that the idea of using parody and a bit of irony and satire does come in quite a few of my works, as you'll see in some of the later ceramic images. Um, so in this piece, I'm not only making fun of my own exhaustion, but I'm also having a bit of a go at the formality that exists around the home with the pretty dull plates and the properness of it all. But we'll talk a bit more about that in the next in this specific in this set of images. So between Grief and High Delight was then the next solo exhibition I had in September 2018. So this would be, I think, the third solo show in 3 years with having had two babies, which was a bit of insanity at the time. So this is an installation view. On the right-hand side is a work titled Entangled Particles, and on the left-hand side is an installation of porcelain works. I didn't give it a kind of an installation title, but all the works were titled separately, and we'll have a look at some of them in a moment. So I'm just going to read out part of the exhibition text, which I think will give you a good sense of the kind of things that I was looking at the time. So in between Grief and High Delight, Ilene Bothma uncovers her experience of motherhood. There's a sense that the truth of being a mother exists in the space between these polarities, in the everyday routines of child rearing. It is in this complex space that Bothma, a mother of two, situates her work, which lies on the spectrum between multiple binaries, art and craft, personal and public, mastery and mystery. Multiplicity is revealed in Bothma's use of scale. Her finely rendered paintings feature mother and child larger than life. The size of the figures reflects those of the intense emotions involved. Conversely, the portraits on ceramic plates are intimate moments, hidden between floral patterns on oddly fleshy clay. Aside from the monochromatic background, the only color featured is the pink of intimate biology, where the boundaries between mother and child are erased. The two are almost indistinguishable under their veils. Bothma's media are likewise varied, smooth and rough, fragile and pliable. In her emphasis on complexity and process, performative nature of what Bothma does exposes the constant labor of parenting tasks. It also, however, serves as a meditative escape. While Between Grief and High Delight exposes aspects of being a mother perhaps not often acknowledged, the thread running through all the work is its power, connection, and strange beauty. So here you can physically see the thread running through. This covering or veil, if you will, is the only one that I've ever used that I didn't make myself. It was crocheted by my studio mate assistant from a rope that is used in the making of rose. So it's crazy strong, and it's used in some kind of weaving under the tar so it doesn't sag. I'm not exactly sure about the technicalities, but it's very smooth. It's like almost a sparkly white, and it doesn't provide any resistance. Um, so I really like that kind of industrial quality in relation to something that's very intimate, personal, and domestic. I am actually currently working on a very large textile piece where I am knitting with this rope. But hopefully, if you ever have me back in the future, we can talk about that work then. Although not specifically talking about my textile works in this presentation, the use of textiles are very much present in everything that I do. So it's about, and I think about the woman's work of it, the kind of the craft element that women have and feminists have used quite often in subverting traditional roles of the woman. And in this image, I'm almost literally entangled in the rope, metaphorically, intimately entangled with my infant and then the entanglement is in the title as well. So, okay, there's just a detail of this work, and there's and then again the insanity, the literal insanity of painting those wires or those little bits of rope. Yeah, although it is meditative in a way, and I think there it does help in a certain sense with some of my anxiety to work on little sections like that. It can also be quite maddening to work on. Here's another installation view of the porcelain work that I want to just talk about a bit. So these are the more intimate moments in relation to the more monumental mother and child, Madonna and child imagery. And these works are again also displayed like hairline cracks that I was talking about in the beginning. And this kind of display of that kind of feels very domestic is something that I seem to keep going back to. This plate, or the porcelain work, is titled Split Skin, which literally refers to the splitting of the skin when you're breastfeeding, the kind of pain involved in it, but also the fact that your child becomes part of your skin. Your skin is kind of walking outside your body, and that intense bonding that happens with the child. So what's a really important aspect of my work is brutal honesty and vulnerability, very much exposure of very private moments. I think this was also influenced by Tracy Emin, whose work I was looking at quite a bit during my undergraduate and postgraduate days. For an Afrikaans girl born in the beginning of the 80s, growing up in quite a conservative household in a small industrial dorpie, the idea of being so incredibly open about your sexual conquest and abortions as Emin was in her work was absolutely profound. And I found it fascinating that somebody could operate like that. It was absolutely mind-boggling to me. And I was particularly influenced by Emin's monoprint, and that is quite visible, I think, in the next images I'm going to show. But just to quickly get back to the idea of brutal honesty, I don't think unless you're honest, you can evoke, if you're not honest, I don't think you can evoke that sense of the uncanny. Something has to feel real. It has to be ordinary. And I think in order to evoke the strangeness and the unheimlich that Freud so often talks about. So my poor husband is incredibly uncomfortable with what I do as well, because I don't always just expose myself for both physically and then of course psychologically, and with all these intimate ideas that I expose, but I sometimes also expose him in the work, as you'll see in the Walkabout. So these kind of flowery pink images are evocative of the body. I think that's enough said about that. So this one was titled Our Damp Spot, and as you can see, that a super conservative Afrikaans husband could find this kind of imagery quite challenging, and it was very much influenced by these kind of monoprints by Emin that I was looking at years and years ago. I didn't even make the connection until yesterday when I was putting this together. So this work deals very much with the lack of dignity in childbirth. Although I didn't actually give natural birth, I think there's zero dignity in a cesarean section as well. So it's looking at the more abject aspects of motherhood, the blood, the guts, the leakage of it all. Um, and the title again uh, is bringing in my own sense of humor, where there isn't just a spot to wash out. It's uh, more about a flood of blood um, during birth and after, and then our damn spot, which was Lady Macbeth's line, trying to get rid of her guilt, is perhaps also me looking at my so-called mommy guilt, and I quite like that play on words. I often have quite a bit of fun with my titles, but they usually do come at the end, right at the end, almost just before I put up a show. So this was an image of me when I was a child. It's one of those rare images where a child looks a bit angry or indignant, I think, um, in photographs of the time. It was before digital cameras. We didn't have cell phones to snap thousands of images. And it was obviously also more expensive to print these images. And we were always, if I look back at the photo albums, everybody's always smiling and posing for the camera. Those albums are much more like today's Instagram. It's much more carefully curated. So here I was looking at what the expectations are on women and the fact that we have to constantly be smiling. The moment that you show too much emotion, you're labeled as hysterical. And the title Apocalypse was me just having a bit of fun because of my temperament. Whenever I was angry as a child, it was generally quite apocalyptic. The end of the world, all the emotions in the extreme. So I think perhaps the photograph that was taken by my father was probably also an attempt to stop this kind of hysteria or temper tantrum, which it probably was. But I just like the delicacy of the image and the kind of quietness of it. And ooh, anyway, this work is titled Head in the Clouds. It's a good example of where the textile elements of my work come together with the porcelain. Again, the body of the mother is shown as someone who's had two children, not as a fitness model. And there's another level, again, a level of physical exposure. The pink thread is crochet thread, but I use knitting, not crocheting, because I can't crochet at all. People often assume that I can, but maybe it's just because I knit so badly and there's lots of holes in it. I'm not quite sure. So I think within this image, the idea of weird marriage comes back a bit because it is a bit of a strange combination to use crochet thread in relation with porcelain. I'm going to move now onto the walkabout area, part of the presentation. Just need some water there. So this is a beautiful installation shot by Mia Tom. And before I start with the walkabout, I'm just going to read the statement from the show as well. Come to terms with death, thereafter anything is possible. Albert Camus. With her latest body of work, artist Ilene Bothma lifts the veil on the particular anxieties of motherhood, as well as its inextricable love. Life, death, and all the fear in between is a series of extraordinary detailed portraits of her two young children, herself and her husband, all seemingly peacefully asleep. The translucent skin and the poses of the sleepers, with their hands resting gently on their chests or their forms obscured under fabric, give us pause, though. Are they only asleep? Ilene uses the conceit of these somnolent subjects to explore in oil paint and watercolor one of the central tenets of human life, the deeply existential angst around dying, and more specifically, the death of loved ones. The exhibition title draws on the concept proposed by anthropologist Ernest Becker in his 1973 book, The Denial of Death, that the majority of human actions are undertaken primarily as a means to ignore or evade death. This body of work, however, functions in opposition to this idea. Through her uncanny portrait, Ilene delves into, confronts, and ultimately comes to terms with her own unbearable fears. Art focused on death and our relationship to it has a long history, from the ancient Egyptian funerary art to the sumptuous lives of the Golden Age Dutch vanitas painters, from the post-mortem images of Victorian photographers to Damien Hirst's The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living. Ilene uses the ritualistic and monotonous nature of her own methods to reduce the fear of the unknown to something familiar, something tolerable. The utter stillness of the paintings, with their soft tones of skin and cloth, with a painstaking repetition of the shapes within the lace, provides the viewer with a meditative escape, a frozen moment to consider fear, love, and loss. Through sharing in her process, Ilene leaves us better equipped to deal with our own intractable sorrows. So I did not write this text. Lena Sulek did. She used to be the manager or the curator at this gallery, and I find it quite helpful that to have someone from an outside perspective write and talk about my work. I do an extensive interview about the work in my studio with her, and then she writes the text. For example, she provided the Cayman quote and linked the title that I thought up to the Ernst Becker book. She also provided some art historical context, but it's interesting once I read what she's written, how all of those things were actually in the back of my mind when I was creating the work. So now I'm going to attempt to go back to the gallery so we can actually see. I'm hoping I'm getting this right. Let's say stop presenting and get a video there. Okay, there we go. I'm just going to move to that. Oh, now I'm throwing everything around. Okay. So this is basically where you enter the gallery. I'm just going to try and move slowly and get the height right here. So this is the first work that you encounter as you walk down the steps. What I really like about this gallery is that it has two spaces. Sorry guys, it isn't as easy as I thought it would be. I'm actually holding the tablet at my knee, so you can get a bit of a sense of all these works as they hang together in relation to that work, which I'll get closer to. I'll obviously show all these images in the PowerPoint in a minute. Don't know how much you can actually see there. And then there you go. What I was trying to say earlier is what I love about the space is that you have two different spaces in the bottom. So a lot of the time the gallery is just one big open area. And in this space, there's two smaller, one large space and then one smaller space. So you can have a bit of time to let the work unfold. Then here at the back, there's a watercolor of my poor husband that gets exposed all the time, and myself. I quite like the way we hung these at the back of the gallery. It's almost like they are guardians of this space, or kind of just spectators from there. So let me just step back here for a minute. This space only holds images of the children. And that's why I quite like us being behind there. It was quite difficult to hang this because you don't want to have all the kind of flowery patterns next to each other, but you also don't want to go with flower pattern, black image, flower pattern. And there was actually one image, one of the paintings that we had to throw out of the show. We had to keep it back because the space just got quite full. I found that you fill a gallery actually much faster than you normally anticipate. Let me just see here. Oh, and then hanging a show like this is always very much a collaborative process for me. My studio mate Lisa Grotter always gets roped into this. She's been hanging shows for 20 years, so much longer than I have. So I feel very confident getting her here in this space because I work quite long on some of the works that I do. I mean, you guys can see it based on the detail. And I think you can get quite precious about the images then. And it helps if you have somebody else kind of making or just backing up your gut feeling, because I kind of felt that painting should not be on the show, but it does help having some backup. I think I can move back to the PowerPoint now. I think it gave quite a good sense of the show. Now I've lost the plot completely. Just give me a second. I need to share my screen again. Sorry, this is all entirely new to me. I have never done anything on Teams before in my life. I think it's not going too badly, all things considered. Okay, here we go. Just move that out of the way and reposition my tablet there for a second. Here we go. So that work is titled Great Expectations. Now you can see it in more detail here. It was on the invite, so those of you who actually saw that is probably quite familiar with it. I find this image to be almost the least disturbing of all the oil works. I think, not that I find any of the works disturbing, but based on my conversations with people, and when I mean objectively try to look at the imagery, I think my son looks quite peaceful, almost fetus-like, almost like he's hanging in some amniotic fluid there. And yeah, it looks just quite peaceful. I think the uncanny element comes in with the lace, which has a bit of a funerary kind of element. I was thinking quite a bit about Victorian death portraits at the time, but without really looking at them too much. I think it was more something that I was thinking about, and how these images were almost beautifying death and in a certain way. And there's often delicate flowers and lace and things like that involved in these like kind of images, or memento mori, if you will. So I was also looking at the Victorian photographic portraits of babies with the mothers hidden behind the textile. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it. When I discovered these images, I was absolutely fascinated with it, and some of them are quite funny as well. So Irene pointed out to me, I didn't realize this, that a lot of the times the women in the class could be the nannies as well, but it wasn't something that I'd realized or really thought about before. And my children never had nannies. They had to go to creche with things. I never had a nanny, so it's not something think that really forms part of my experience. And I think, as you know by now, I don't really make anything or work with anything that is outside my experience. So what I was thinking about mainly when looking at these images, when making these works, is that I was interested in how sometimes these kids just seem to be floating on this kind of sea of cloth. And I was thinking quite a lot about how the mother is obscured, how kind of the most vital person in this child's life is relegated to a space in the dark. And then, of course, how the work of the mother within the domestic space is often also seen as less than or second rate to that of a man, especially when a woman decides to be a stay-at-home mother. So basically, the use of the cloth and Great Expectations, as well as in all the other images, for me is a direct reference to the idea of the hidden mother. So there's just another installation view where you can see the relationship between the making of madness on the left and the sound of silence. These images were made to kind of hang together in a way, but they didn't look great next to each other on the long wall. So I think we found a very good solution in hanging them on the corner like that. So the making of madness is a subtle reference to Ophelia by Millet, which I realized when I was taking the photograph, I felt it really resonated with that painting. Here's the making of madness, and then there's the painting. I don't know, maybe it's all in my head, but I really felt that image kind of resonated with this one. So the story goes that Ophelia is driven mad and drowned after discovering that her partner Hamlet has killed his father. And I kind of wanted to honor that story in the title. But again, the title also refers to other possibilities. The fact that the death of a child could drive a mother to madness. But again, there's the ambivalence. Is the child asleep? Is the child dead? I'm hoping ambivalence in this image. So it could be about driving the mother to the brink of madness as well, because Mia never sleeps. So there's those two possibilities: the death of the child driving the mother to madness, or the child driving the mother to madness. Conceptually, I think we can talk quite a bit about this, about all these works, but I think the kind of exhibition text covers a lot of that. So just on a practical note, I just want to mention the amount of bribery that is involved getting a 4-year-old to lie still like this for these photographs. If you look at this one, the amount of complaints about the scratchiness of the cloth and I can't breathe, etc. Was I mean, it's required a trip to the toy store, I can promise you that. But on a more serious note, these images, like the images in the show, my way of dealing with a mother's fear. I do suffer from anxiety, and I think by putting the potential death of my children just out there, I make it feel more palatable. It's the worst fear that there is. It's through that ritualistic, repetitive process of painting that I can come to terms with the agony of the idea of losing the most precious thing in my life. So every brushstroke becomes a meditation. So the black cloth is very much a death shroud in the sound of silence. And again, I try to keep the relationship between the aesthetically pleasing and the kind of macabre subject matter. I try to keep that tension there by painting every fold as beautifully as I can, but still holding the form. Okay. These two watercolors, Into the Next on the left and False Awakening on the right. I'm not going to talk too much about this. I think they're quite self-explanatory in terms of the context of the show. However, just in terms of the scale, I usually play with much bigger works in relation to smaller works, more intimate works, as you could see in the previous exhibition between Brief and Hide a Light. I find also that creates a different kind of tension, and also that life is a bit like that. There's the intimate, the smaller moments, and then there's the bigger, larger, more monumental moments, and it becomes a bit of a metaphor for that. Clinging to Eventually, this is the only image on the exhibition itself, except for the one that we took out, which I'll show in a moment, that features the mother and child. So it's the intimate moment, but it's also a bit of a throwback to the previous exhibition, and it again illustrates that intimacy. I like how there is a bit of a moment of brightness. I don't know if that's the right word, but a moment of hope, if you will. It's not all about death or dying or sleeping. There is a moment of joy in the show as well, because I think it would become really macabre if you don't have that moment in there. So this is titled Hide and Seek. It's another image under the black cloth or the shroud, if you will. And again, painted in quite a bit of detail to make what could be quite an unpalatable subject more pleasing. Of course, in complete contrast to that image, which I quite like, and I really love the tension between not only the scale but also the subject matter. So here's the installation shot by Mia Tom. It's quite beautiful, I think, and this. These images are on the left-hand side, which is titled The Great Perhaps. Is possibly the most personal on the show, I think. But what I really love about them is that people, and here, if I can give you any advice ever as an artist to anyone, is that you have to trust your gut. Everybody told me, or I got the sense when people were looking at them or talking to me about this idea that I'm crazy to make them. These are the kinds of works that will never sell. You're just wasting your time, that kind of thing. And the two children on the side were sold before the show even opened. And this is the strongest work on the exhibition, I feel. Just to go through them quickly, and then we'll return to them again. So there's my poor husband, exposed for all the world to see, slack-jawed, if you will, not muscles flexing. And I think he was very uncomfortable with this image. Yeah, and there's little Mia. So these images are obviously ambiguous in the sense that are they sleeping, are they dead, and what is the context of that. So I find them quite difficult to talk about. I've realized because they are so incredibly private, and they do feel like memento mori in a way. Thinking about memories, the inevitability of death, and they're also linked very much again to the Victorian death portrait, where people are made quite beautiful in death. I don't know if you'll be able to see. It's not that great quality, but all the lace in the background it probably took much longer to paint the lace than the figures themselves. I found that it was really important for me to paint the lace in as much detail as I possibly could, because at that meditative aspect, in terms of in relation to images of my children that appeared to be dead, was kind of necessary just to kind of deal with my anxiety around them. I'm actually not explaining them great, but I think I've talked enough for now. Just to kind of wrap up, these are then the images of me and my husband under our cloth. Again, going back to the idea of the death portrait. So this was the final image that didn't make it onto the show. It's titled From a Whisper to the Screen. And it was created in direct contrast to the Madonna and child imagery. On the one hand, it's a quiet revolt against the imagery, against the intimacy between mother and child. A kind of attempt probably to break free from the crushing expectations by me slipping out of the veil on the left. But on the other hand, it's also an intimate portrait of a mother and child lying peacefully asleep. The veil or the lace cloth could just be protecting the child against mosquitoes, if you will. So, as with all the works with that certain level of tension, is the child underneath the lace alive or asleep? There's also then the reverse in these images, in this specific image, of those Victorian baby portraits, where the mom isn't hidden underneath the textile piece, but the child is. So maybe I think there was a bit of subversion happening in this, and me attempting to kind of assert my own sense of identity in my role as a mother in this specific image. So yeah, and From a Whisper to a Scream, and as the title is, was looking at the kind of slow build-up of emotions around perhaps both losing my identity and maybe regaining my sense of identity as my children started getting older. I think the most important thing around this whole show that I never mentioned was the relationships between this one and the previous show. So in between Grief and High Delight, I dealt extensively with the breastfeeding and the intimacy of that. But I think this body of work, where the fear starts becoming quite important, is kind of a direct result of that show, or maybe a better way to say it is a direct result of life, because as your children grow older, they stop breastfeeding, and there's a certain letting go that as a mother you have to do. Your child starts asserting their independence, and with that independence, I think comes a lot of fear and anxiety, and in a very different way from the kind of expectations and the burdens of breastfeeding that I was showing in Between Grief and High Delight. So life, death, and fear in between is very much about the anxiety of starting to separate from my children and having to live with them growing off and starting to assert their independence. And perhaps that's then where I think we should leave that. Although this specific work did not make it onto the exhibition, I think maybe it could even be a next step, a next area of investigation, that re-establishment of the self, or of the sense of self after losing it in motherhood. The question that I often ask myself, is that even possible? Is it even possible to look at yourself not as a mother? Would it be a re-establishment, or would it be a complete reinvention? And can it even be done? I'm currently working around ideas of legacy, what we are leaving behind as mothers to our children, both environmentally and psychologically. And maybe that's enough of a reinvention or re-establishment. I don't really know. If I did know, however, I would probably stop making work, and I have to continue work until I've figured it all out, which I suspect will be very much until the end. So that is me, and I'm hoping to find my way back to the PowerPoint, to the video, which I'm still struggling with. Themes, here we go. Almost there, I think. Stop presenting. Okay.
Thank you so much, Ilene. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure there can be lots of questions. And thank you for being so sort of amazing with this technology and moving between different situations. It's so great for us to have that. People, any questions?
Yeah, Ilene, I wanted to thank you. I think that you've been really generous about the way that you work and the experiences that you have as you work. One thing that I always want to know about, and it struck me quite powerfully to ask you this, is I'm interested in the process of thinking through an artwork and how it all comes about. Do you start with a concept, or do you start by encountering a piece of porcelain or a pattern or a little piece of fabric or textile? Where does it all begin usually? Is there a similarity in the kind of cues that you respond to, or does it differ?
I think it differs quite a lot, but I think I often respond to textile.
Yeah,
and then
I wondered.
I do respond to the tactile elements of it. I'd often start knitting something and then just kind of throwing it over a child. I think I was talking about that incredible white rope
Yes.
that I've started making an installation with now, and I've just realized that I'm just going to throw that over Mia and paint her like a little mountain, because I started looking at more environmental things, like what we are leaving behind for our children. A little bit tongue in cheek, as I was speaking to a friend before we had the whole COVID fiasco. We had Greta, or what was her name, throwing all the environmental issues down our throat, which is a good thing, I agree, but we were talking about us as mothers. It's bad enough having to keep our children alive. Now we have to think about the freaking world ending in a whole environmental boom or complete disaster. So I was kind of thinking about those things when I started doing the knitting. But I think I really do respond to using the textiles in relation to the body. I think that something often comes out of that. I think also the whiteness of the cloth also started kind of becoming reminiscent of icebergs, and the whiteness of it felt like snow. So that's probably how the idea around the environment came about.
So quite tactile.
Yes, yeah, and especially in the more kind of sculptural work, it would be walking through a secondhand shop or whatever, and an object had to speak to me. That was, I think, also some of my weird marriage requirements back in the day, that an object had to actually speak to me. It didn't really come about. Yeah, so it's quite organic in that sense, I would say.
Other questions? Maybe I'll ask one. I was struck that you cited Tracy Emin at the beginning, but in fact I see so many other kind of references and links to sort of a rich body of discourse about maternity. I think here in South Africa, say Terry Gergen, Penny Siopis, the exhibition, particularly that Terry Kurgan did, I think it was the late 1990s, of Bringing Up Baby. And
Yeah.
having
I think
worked through,
yeah, that is.
I think Christine's also, Dixie, if she's still here with us, has also worked with maternity. Cindy Maricela also was speaking to us previously. So I think it's quite an evocative theme. And I was wondering if you, and I was thinking historically, looking at somebody like Mary Cassatt, I thought immediately of Mary Cassatt when you had that one painting up that was to do with the mother and child. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about other people's work you might have looked at or thought about in regard to maternity as a topic.
I've tried to much as people work specific with maternity, with motherhood, because I find it quite intimidating. It sounds ridiculous, but now I'm trying to remember the name. She's a painter. She did that beautiful sculpture with the bunny, the Pieta.
Rashada Cross.
Thank you. And I find it extremely intimidating when they see these things, and then it's like, oh, why didn't I think of that? That is just perfect. That just says everything in one sculpture. So I do tend to not go and do intense research, but one of the artists whose work I love is Claudette Schroeder, and I saw her show. I mean, she deals so beautifully with motherhood and relationships in her work, and I saw a show in New York last year, and it's just, I mean, it's just beautiful. I mean, Penny Siop is I've often looked at her work even since postgraduate, undergraduate years. And then, yeah, I'm missing someone.
I think what sets your work apart is your light touch. If you compare with the kind of heaviness of Rashada's imagery, not least because of her painting style, which is very obsessive and intensive. I thought about that. I was comparing your work with Rashada's in my mind, and I thought that it's the freshness in your work and the delicacy, which also has a brutality and strength. But I liked it that it was different.
Thank you. Yeah, it's always so intimidating to speak about your work, but it's lovely to get the compliment. It's great.
Other questions?
Picking up perhaps, Ilene, it's more an observation perhaps on what Philippa said about the lightness of your touch when on a different, slightly different theme. I mean, we focused on motherhood here, but when I'm looking at those black satin covered hillock bodily shapes in your latest body of work, like The Sound of Silence and the other ones, I was struck, well, just for me, by perhaps other people don't know, but I've seen Ilene has a series of embroidered doilies, very intricately embroidered in quite pornographic representations of women on doilies, and that's something which I find quite interesting, and I haven't followed up with in her work before. But there's a very, very worked and sort of feminine touch of this embroidery, the quite pornographic images, and again speaking to different roles that women might be expected to fulfill, and this might be like a sexualized woman or sexualized for the male gaze, and yet also a mother, and then those silk, those black satin objects, to me actually look quite like S&M, but in a kind of way, as well as and so like it's an interesting way. I wouldn't have thought of that if I hadn't thought of that previous doily embroidery series of yours, and so I'm like, that's quite interesting. Yes.
Because specifically in that show that I did those doilies, it was called The Theatre of the Mother Court. It was very much about looking at the role of the the mother, and it was more. It wasn't exclusively motherhood, so it was that kind of pregnant, barefoot in the kitchen, kind of whore in the bedroom, these ridiculous expectations, kind of those things. So those embroideries of the pornographic images is very much tongue-in-cheek, kind of in terms of what the expectation is of the mother and of the wife, I would say, in that sense.
And there's a strange, very, as you say, very sort of parodic, very humorous play between like presence and absence. So this woman, like in those doilies, who is so obviously posing, and so obviously also in some ways, because you assume you're embroidering, and yet your embroidery is from the view of, as it were, the stereotypical heterosexual man is objectifying a woman who's seeing the wife. But here, and so it's playing with a strange presence and absence of the female subjectivity, and in those satin-covered hillock shapes, when you don't know what is even underneath there, but you know, like the titles like hide and seek, it also seems to be playing with this sort of presence and absence. You could be physically here, but your subjectivity is absent, or that different roles flow in and out of like the one body at different times, and it's all quite ambiguous and in some ways confusing, but also, as you say, quite empowering to represent that and to be brutally honest about it, as you say.
Yeah. No, but I love that you made that connection. It's so interesting. Now I'm never going to look at my kids under black covers.
Oh, that's terrible. But then again, I suppose, doesn't it go back to that fear you articulated as your children begin to grow? You know, that they're moving away from you, and they're entering the world, and the world can be a wonderful but a cruel place as well, and you don't have control over determining their happiness. And yeah,
Absolutely. Now, I found that Irene gets me. Irene wrote the most beautiful article about my work. I think she understands me more intimately than my husband does.
No, not at all. And so Brenda edited that the journal, the edition of Image Text is going to in November.
So
Yes, you'll definitely get a copy.
Oh, very.
All on these narratives that are held in material objects.
I'd like to read that.
Oh, you have to.
And to ask questions.
Hi, Ilene. My name's Alex, and I've been ironing while you've been talking, and I thought, well, and I must go sit at a desk before I ask this question, and then I thought, no, I won't. So I'm here at the ironing board because I think it's a bit appropriate.
Have you seen my ironing board piece?
This is a comment, and I've been thinking, what is the question I'd like to frame around it, and I think I have it. So off of what Brenda was saying about all these artists who have reflected on motherhood or processed motherhood through their work, I kept thinking of Betty Cilliers Barnard while you were talking. Artists who haven't reflected on motherhood through their works. Like, you know, I think one of her sons was very newly born, and she went to Europe for 6 months and toured and worked in a studio, and, you know, and was making artworks not about her family. And I was so struck that your work is so conceptually rich, and you can see there's like such a kind of visceral pull to make, but that you and this sort of conflict between wanting to make and kind of family commitments, and that you've pulled your family into that world so strongly. And so I'm curious to hear any reflections or comments on that. But I think my question is, does making art with your family, does it feel like it helps make peace with what you want to do domestically and what you want to do artistically?
it does bring those two worlds together in a way that makes it a bit easier, if you will. It's also what's great about it is that I always have my subject matter with me. I mean, those little monsters can be rallied at any point to throw them under a piece of cloth or whatever. So,
Yeah.
but I find that this is a difficult one. I wanted the thing that I really wanted to do this year was go on a residency. Thank you, COVID. Bye. That never happened because I wanted to really see what would happen with my thinking and my work if I was away for a month from my kids. I think that would be a great exercise for me to see what kind of images I come up with in a very different space. So I don't think this is answering your question at all, but it is something that I've been thinking about in order to challenge myself.
Yeah. I think it's such a fascinating mix, and I think it's so great that we live in a time where it's much more possible to bring these worlds together, or it feels much more possible.
Yeah.
Betty Celeste Barnard was a huge celebrity in Afrikaner artistic, and she had also a lot of opportunities come her way. And so it doesn't surprise me at all to hear how she pursued professional opportunities when her children were little. It's just a little side comment.
No, that's amazing. It's my thing at the moment is that, but it does make it difficult because my life is structured very much around my children. I think I don't know if I should say this out loud, but I make a crappy joke that I'm a single parent with a shitty trust fund because my husband works extremely long hours. So he takes the kids to school in the morning, but that's about that. I do the pickup, I do the bath, I do bedtime, I do dressing them in the mornings. I basically do all those things. So the idea of leaving for a month or so to go on a residency is a little bit terrifying on the one hand, but also it's also difficult because the practicality of him having to earn a living and needing certain hours to work in order for me to be able to go on residency, for example. So it's always that little bit of tension around how to manage these things, which I mean I'm dealing with in my work as well. Is that constant kind of up and down of the whole kind of ecosystem of it.
Ilene, thank you so much for introducing us to your works. It's been absolutely
lovely.
Thanks so much for having me.
Wonderful. I sort of was thinking as you were. I was thinking as you were talking about and looking at those amazing paintings. I thought, geez, all that detail. Why didn't you take a photograph and do it that way? And then you're speaking about the meditativeness. The technique is as intrinsic to the meaning as your embroideries are, where you deliberately make them not good knitting or not good crochet or anti-crochet. So I think you manage your technique beautifully. Your subject matter is very moving. Thank you so much. It's been wonderful for all of us.
Thank you, guys. Thank you for listening. It's always great when people actually listen to you speak. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much.